and the speeches from the US Chamber of Commerce, but also from the Steelworkers Union and other interests in the US have made it very clear that they view this as one of the 21st century issues that the agreement needs to address. But the very interesting nature of the discourse around it is that it's not usually discussed in terms of the other TPP countries, it's discussed in terms of China. And you have a very clear undercurrent all the way through the discussions at the US end that this is ultimately about creating disciplines that China may. And that, in a sense, fits with the broader US position that there is a strategic objective behind this agreement, which is the dual pivot into the Asia Pacific, being the redirection of the military presence from Afghanistan and Iraq up into the Asia Pacific, and the economic pivot, which is through the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, using rules which are US-style rules, not simply exporting US rules, but some of the rhetoric around SOEs is very clear that it is about contesting the model or the paradigm of state-supported capitalism versus I always hesitate before I call it free-market capitalism, because that's not what it is, but the US style of liberalisation and deregulation and global supply chains. And so when the US first came up with its proposals on SOEs, it was very much devised in response to those pressures, and the US Chamber of Commerce itself said that the design was drawn very heavily from the work they'd already done in the OECD and the work that had been done in the APEC OECD joint initiatives. And so in a sense it was drawing on a framework that had been established in the OECD context. A lot of the work done there had been done but to counterbalance that, we kind of levy an offset payment on state entities that make them less competitive vis-a-vis the private sector than they would be without the offset payment. So it's based around microeconomic arguments as opposed to around the commercial interests in the US model. So you've got the two of these inside the one text. And they don't speak to each other. And so we ended up with that in the situation in July 2013 with this composite text. And my understanding is that it was revised again in September of 2013. But there was still huge reluctance from most governments to participate in the negotiations. Australia, of course, now that it was a part of it, that had broken the fact that no one wanted to talk about the text, so there now was more discussion around the text itself. But because this was novel, there were, unlike the intellectual property is controversial, but there are existing rules and there's some clarity and maturity around the text. When you come to SOEs, there is no model. Right? Even the US FTAs, there's no competition chapter in some of them. In others of them, there is a state enterprise section along with monopolies, but it is quite weak. The Singapore one is the one that has the strongest disciplines, but imposes asymmetrical obligations on Singapore and on the US. Quite extraordinary, and required Singapore to move towards privatisation. Now, to put that into the TPP context would have been incendiary. And so they had no clear model, nor did they have a clear definition of what was a state enterprise. Is it anything that is owned by the state? Is it, do you define a state enterprise by ownership and control, in which case does it have to be something that's in a corporate kind of structure? Or is it any public entity, such as a university or a public hospital or whatever? Is it only affected if it's engaging in commercial activities? If so, how do you define commercial? And we've had this issue in the services arena for a long time. Is charging fees, or is a partial cost recovery? Is a university that charges international student fees for profit versus domestic fees that are subsidised? So how do you work out what is commercial? Especially if there's a hybrid set of objectives. Or is it only for an entity that is designed to make a profit, which narrows down the scope? Now, the US wanted a broad definition, and that scared the other countries hugely. And that was one of the reasons why there was such reluctance to engage with the US. But once you had the Australian and the US proposals there, they had to try to work out what was defined as a state enterprise. And they still have not. They have been moving towards, in the last month, as I understand it. I don't know what happened yesterday in the discussions, but up until yesterday, they still had not advanced on that question. The other questions that they were stuck on, what would the disciplines on state enterprises be? Would it be national treatment, that you can't discriminate in favour of your local state enterprises and against foreign entities? Or is it more of a test around commercial disadvantage for any competitors, domestic or foreign, actual or putative? And if so, how do you identify that? How do you calculate intangible and diverse benefits that purportedly come to a state enterprise and say this is a commercial advantage that has an adverse effect on other entities? And so they have a difficulty in working out what the disciplines will be and how to define them. And the US is more concerned about actual competitive disadvantage. The Australian model is more the theoretical disadvantage. So you've got the two models that may use the same language but actually imply quite different kinds of tests. In addition to that, my understanding is that this applies to state enterprises that not only produce goods, and if we look in a number of countries, especially the Asian countries, there are state enterprises that produce goods, but also services. And being able to calculate what the competitive disadvantages in the services arena are terribly difficult. So you've got, what are people's tastes? Do people want a grounded service delivery as opposed to an electronic service delivery from across the border, and so on? And from what we gathered, the test that they were planning to use was borrowed from the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which was an adverse effects test. But the adverse effects test actually technically can't work. And I've done quite a lot of technical work around why that is. So what we've got is a whole series of problems on a spectrum, from conceptual problems to definitional problems to highly technical problems to political problems of what would this mean in countries that have very significant state-owned enterprises. Now obviously Vietnam is the one that has the largest number of big and small ones. Malaysia has a significant number and uses it for economic development and redistributive purposes. You've got Brunei and Mexico that have oil and gas state entities that are really significant. You've got Codelco in Chile. And then you've got the sovereign wealth funds. Temasek here, Khazanah in Malaysia, and various others. So what are the implications for all of them? So you can see that the politics of it has come in behind the resistance to negotiations. So back in Salt Lake City, when they'd had this new composite text, one of the negotiators described it to me as, it's still rather like a Christmas tree. Everyone is still hanging on the chapter, the bits that they want to protect or they want to add as offensive interest. So it's not, it wasn't clear, even in Salt Lake City, whether it would apply only at the central government level or also at the state, provincial, local government levels, which is very big in the US context, important for Canada. Some countries like New Zealand don't like it only being at the central level because we're a unitary country, so the impact's more on us. There were issues about exceptions. Could you have exceptions to the coverage for particular sectors? And it was known right from the beginning that the US had engaged in exceptionalism. It had carved out Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. It had carved out entities it had taken control of after the financial crisis, such as General Motors. And it had very specific exceptions it was proposing that were particular to the US. So the question then was, do other countries get to add to that? And I think that's still a work in progress. In addition, the question of what size SOEs might be covered. Because the chapter is understood to have quite onerous compliance obligations, reporting obligations, obligations that will require SOEs to comply with the entire agreement, which means they need to understand the whole 29 chapters and what it means for their operations, which most governments don't have the capacity to do, let alone the state entity. So there have been suggestions of a threshold for smaller state-owned enterprises that would carve them out. But that's not necessarily the concern for many countries because some of the SOEs that are most important are the bigger ones. So that kind of exception doesn't necessarily help them. Questions about whether there should be protections for public good functions, public health, culture, broadcasting, those kind of areas. Whether there should be a schedule, whether you should be able to do what you can do with services and investment and list areas or list entities that are not covered. Now none of that had been resolved before you came to Singapore. And if you have a look on the documents that have been leaked onto Huffington Post this morning, you'll see this a discussion in there about, if I can remember it correctly, I just read it very quickly this morning, that there were, that they have been told in Salt Lake City to narrow down to 4 issues that are going to be discussed here that would set the parameters for the next lots of ongoing negotiations on this. But whichever country was the author of that document was very sceptical about whether they will get far in Singapore in resolving those questions. Now I understand that they met yesterday, but I don't know what... the ministers discussed this yesterday, but I haven't had a chance to get a sense yet. So that's... I don't know. I need to go and find out. Yeah, but you can ask. So that's the kind of scenario. This one, amongst all of the chapters, is the least mature text in the agreement. But it is one that the US has made a lot of play of in the Congress, and not to deliver on it may be very difficult, but if it's to be delivered on in a form that the US finds acceptable, it will have quite significant implications, especially in Asia. And now that Japan is part of the mix as well, obviously the target is Japan Post Bank, Japan Post Insurance, the express delivery, but also some of the other entities like the Norinchukin Bank, those entities that are seen as having a privileged position in the Japanese market. So it's a kind of watch this space, except we can't watch it because we don't have the details.
Is there, I mean, what you've described there, you get to the end of it, you go, why don't you just drop this chapter? Especially if it's one you haven't tackled another agreement. Is anyone talking about just saying, actually, this is just way too hard? Or are they still pressing on?
Earlier in the year, I think those discussions were still happening, and in fact, up until close to Salt Lake City, there was still, I think, 4 governments that were not participating actively in the discussions. And they, if you look on the HuffPost thing, I saw that there's a statement there that says we now have all 12 in the talks, and it said that Peru and Malaysia had joined the talks. So it was definitely all of them. And my suspicion is that Brunei was probably one. And I'm not sure who the 4th was. But once you've got it, Vietnam has obviously watching very closely what is happening with this, but I don't know if they were actively, if they were absenting themselves from the discussion, which the others were, or whether they were just passively watching what was happening. But I think it's logical that this is one of the big issues for Vietnam. That and the textiles are probably the 2 biggest issues. But once everyone's at the table, it's much more difficult to walk away. One of the things that could have happened, could still happen, is that parts of it could be considered too hard. I would think it's, and the people from the US here will know better than I, but I think it is very difficult to imagine, given the attention that's been given to this in the US, them putting something up without it.
So what do you end up with? Do you end up with a sort of a bland political statement, or do you end up with actual discipline?
Depends on how much leverage is put on, I think. One of the concerns I feel for the poor negotiators who've been trying to get their heads around this technical stuff, that politicians can come in over the top and make a decision and say this is going to be the definition and we're going to have this, this and this, and then tell the officials that they have to make legal sense out of it in the text. And that's what happens in these kind of negotiations. Yeah. And so it is quite possible that they may be instructed to go and do that. And it won't be easy. And what I suspect we will then find is we may have phase-in periods. It will be, from what I understand, is the methods in here. There's a whole range of options, from requirements and requests for disclosure to committee structures that would call you before it to explain, similar to what happens with monopolies, through to actual disputes processes. And what often happens is that the legal mess only becomes really apparent when you're in that phase of trying to implement. And then what you do about it, as we found in, say, the financial services area, is that you don't want to admit that it's a problem. So you don't go back and renegotiate it. So for China, the situation is very clear that this is a model that is being designed for China, including for when China's SOEs operate in TPP countries. And so what we're not sure about yet is how the definition might apply to SOEs of non-TPP countries operating inside the TPP framework. And so given say CITIC's investments in various places, there are big issues that could come to bear on China. In addition to, I should say, the SOEs are also covered in the investment chapter and the government procurement chapter. So you've got other sets of rules.
Right. Just on that, I mean, not clear how the model might be applied to non-TPP countries working within the TPP framework. So it was anticipated there would be some sort of defensive mechanism against SOEs from outside the bloc.
Well, I'm not sure because I haven't seen the text. I just moved on the basis of what we've been able to find. But it would not surprise me, given that the US discussion has been so China-centered, for there to be some way of being able to get at those SOEs. But it could be through the investment chapter as well.
How would you do that? If you were drafting it?
If you had a subsidiary that was established in, say, Malaysia or Vietnam from China, and it was then claimed to be the beneficiary of non-commercial advantages, then that could be used to trigger the disciplines. But I mean, that is pure speculation on my part.
I just wonder what kind of discipline.
You mean what's the sanction?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at, if they are using, and I understand they are, the analogy to the adverse effects test in the subsidies and upgrading measures agreement, then it would involve some hard sanctions of some kind in relation to goods or services.
In relation to what?
Goods or services, depending on what the entity is. But I don't think that has got very far because that there is resistance amongst some, or has been, I don't know if there still is, to enforcement. And in fact, in some of the US FTAs, there isn't an enforcement mechanism around, not a hard enforcement mechanism around this. So there is no jurisprudence that is directly relevant to this particular set of proposals.
I think if you look at the different state-owned enterprises from the different countries, whether it's in terms of ownership or others, I think maybe they lie different places on the spectrum. And on this end, you may have the US, and it's very much the labor market based. But on the other end, you may have China, Vietnam, maybe Vietnam. But in the middle, maybe you have Singapore, which is basically still state-owned, but they are saying that we are operating as a private entity. So my question is, where do you think that people will actually find a balance between these two findings?
I don't know the answer to that. It depends on how much pressure comes on to bear. I think that there is a...
I ask this because China, although it's on the other end of the spectrum, but actually it's trying to move closer, at least to the middle, or at least to the Singapore position where the state-owned enterprise will be operating private entities complement this?
I think it is very clear that the kind of model that Vietnam and China are talking about in terms of state enterprise reform is not the model that would be in this chapter. This chapter is likely to be much more rigorous and a much quicker transformation that is not designed around the particular conditions of the countries most directly affected. This will be designed to reflect the offensive interests of those who are proposing the chapter. So it depends on how much defence there can be. And I know that there has been a lot of pressure that there has to be an ownership and control definition. And that Australia and New Zealand have been pushing, and this is in the Huffington Post stuff this morning, for the entities that are affected to be profit-oriented entities, which narrows the scope of the chapter in terms of the kind of entities it will cover. But if you look at the definitions of what they consider to be a non-commercial advantage, and you look at use of land, or the implied guarantee against bankruptcy of being a government-owned entity, those are still going to be accusations that will be brought to bear against SOEs in China or in Vietnam, or indeed even in New Zealand and Australia, because we don't let our SOEs go bust either. I think what you're looking at would be in both Vietnam and China very dramatic changes, and it would then depend on what the phase-in period is and whether you can get exceptions for certain kinds of entities and so on.
So for Vietnam, because maybe it's the one closest to China in terms of SOEs. The changes that is demanded is so dramatic. How would you
Thank you.
to make the conditions, especially for China, the state-owned enterprises actually controls, I think, at least almost half the GDP.
Yeah, and that's why obviously Vietnam will be very concerned about the implications for this, and I think you need to ask Mr. Khan about that. It may be now that that information is out on the Huffington Post this morning, you may have a bit more. I haven't had a chance to have a really good look at it yet, but there is a bit of information there on the SOEs. For those of us who are observers, we rely on you guys as journalists as well to ask the questions. Because very little is known about this chapter. People know about the intellectual property and the BEPS issues and investment, but not about this one. And especially in Vietnam, I think it's people understand the garments and the textiles because it's part of everyday life and discussion and the economy, but the notion that a trade agreement might do something to the state enterprises is much harder to grasp.
Well, I thought that this area is keep going over the years. That's what I thought. But my question is, if it's possible for Malaysia and Vietnam to sign up the sort of some sort of conclusion this time without this chapter.
No, I don't think that the US would allow individual countries to exit any chapter. We are having problems with discussions even to take exceptions to application, for example, of the investor rights to sue under the investment chapter, or differential agricultural market access commitments. And so what they might do is to give a phase-in period, more for Vietnam than for Malaysia. But I don't know. It depends on what the US thinks it can sell through Congress. And whether it might, whether there might be certain kinds of SOEs that might be subject to the exceptions. If the US can have Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and so on, then can there be an exception for oil and gas? That doesn't help either, well, helps Malaysia a little bit, but doesn't help Vietnam. And I think you will only get exceptions if there is a critical mass of countries that are concerned about a particular issue. And I hope Vietnam gets support.